literature or trot them out when you need donors or you want to look like you're working for the underserved. You have to take those extra steps to actually make sure you're in those communities, that you're hearing their needs, that you're addressing their needs. Now, serving east of the river will be a little bit easier for me because I'm from there and I live there. But I've lived all over the city. I've lived in Ward 3, I've lived in Ward 5, I've lived in Ward 1. So I know that there are different needs in different parts of the city, but I know they're connected. The reason we have overcrowded schools in Ward 3 is because people don't trust the schools in Ward 7, so they take their kids across town. Now, if we're really looking at this as at-large council members, we know that if we fix the problems and we fix the resource dearths that exist east of the river, you actually relieve some of the pressure off the system generally.
Thank you. I believe Mr. McLaughlin said he lived in Ward 7. Did you say you lived in Ward 7?
I said east of the river, though. He's now I live on the other side of the river.
Oh, the new Ward 7.
The new Ward 7.
It's all good. It's all good. We welcome you to Ward 7.
You're definitely welcome. I want to get you in.
All right, Ms. Silverman, 90 seconds.
Well, I love any talk about redistricting.
So that's for another night. We'll be here all day and we're getting to that.
Here's what I'd say. I'm an at-large council member, and I swim in my lane. What I mean by that is the way we do budgeting for our schools leads to inequity. Because we have a $19 billion budget in our city. We have plenty of money. Yet when I do school visits, as I did recently, there are roofs that are leaking. There are bathrooms that are walled off because kids can't, because there's water pouring into them. We don't have full-time nurses in our schools. Here's what I'm saying about the roadmap. Something is wrong. And one thing I think you can say about me is I ask a lot of questions and I keep working to get answers. Here's what I'll say. This new council needs a standalone education committee. It needs an aggressive chair who is going to really focus on the equity issues so we don't have schools in Ward 7. So, Martin Luther King Elementary isn't saying, somehow we're losing staff. That's nuts. Let me talk about Judiciary Committee. Okay, it needs to be smaller. People are feeling the city is unsafe. We need to address it. We need to address the real public safety issues. So we need to focus on our violence interrupter programs, MPD, FEMS, OUs, our Office of Unified Command, or Communications. These are real serious issues and we need a real focus on the council to address them.
Hold on to that mic,
Yes,
Ms.
ma'am.
Silverman. I'm glad that you just pivoted over to public safety because that is our next line of questions from our sponsors. So how would you improve the district's current violence intervention efforts?
I think we need to coordinate. Here's three things. We need to have a strategy, especially a strategy to deal with all the illegal guns in our city. We need to have coordination. When I asked at a judiciary hearing, I'm not even a member of the committee, but a year ago, there was the deputy mayor, the chief, Linda Hartley Harper, head of the mayor's violence prevention office, and I believe the head of her violence interruption program. I said, who is in charge of our, anti-violence programs? That's the answer I got for 10 seconds. I'm serious though. For 10 seconds, everyone was looking at each other. That's a problem. We need to coordinate. And then we need to figure out what we're doing in terms of the interaction between violence interruption and MPD and our other public safety programs. We have to work together. Right now, we're working separately. That's not a strategy.
Mr. McLaughlin, same question. How would you improve the district's current violence intervention efforts? You have 90 seconds.
I think it's an all of the above strategy, not one specific thing. So I'm going to go long term to short term. We've decimated the out of school time budget. Alyssa just talked about how we have a $19.5 billion budget. We only have 21 million that goes to out of school time. Some of those rec centers, et cetera, that Giuseppe was talking about. We need to increase that. We need to think about how are we supporting our young people and having resources and support that they need to grow and grow effectively. I also think from a school standpoint, thinking about how do you have different pathways vocational programs, apprenticeship programs, college pathways. How are we really supporting kids in knowing I have a pathway after I graduate or leave school? I live a block from Eastern. Kids hang out in my yard all the time, so now that I'm running, I'm like, Brandon Block, I'm running for DC Council. How do we help you reach your potential? And I hear so many kids scared about what's happening next. So I think that's one thing, the long-term solutions. Two, on the very short-term solutions, we need to adequately resource NPLs and social workers and other things, but we are asking them to intervene when violence occurs, and that we are supporting them in doing so, and that we are holding them accountable for their closure rates. We're then holding the U.S. Attorney's Office accountable. We're fulfilling the judicial vacancies that are lying fallow right now. These are all detailed strategies that take hard work and operational detail. That's the type of work you need on council to change things.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. Same question, 90 seconds.
Thank you so much for that question. First, as I said before, council needs to refund our police department instead of defunding them. I've spoken to officers all across the city, and every one of them have leaned toward being 1 foot out the door because of the way things are going right now. The council, including the 3 council members that are in this race right now, all unanimously destroyed the morale of those officers. They took away from them the dream and the future of what they had planned. And neither of them had either been a security guard at Walmart to be able to tell the chief how much money he needs, or any of the officers what they need. We are overstressing our police officers, and we are overstressing our teachers and our public school staff. We are overstressing our sanitation workers and our fire and EMS workers. Everyone right now is under the gun. And unless we wake up and realize that first, as I said before, I've done the study and found that they are all 30% under what they should be paid. And that money will come from not paying $1,200 for $200 toilets on these construction projects and $8 for a $1.50 brick. We have got to get rid of the people who have no interest of the mass number of people in this city and put people in that can get it done. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Marshall, since you're up and stretching your legs. 90 seconds.
Thought you forgot about me. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to burn some of my time because I have to clarify something that both of the incumbents have said that's not true. Very frequently, these council members will pass bills with no intention or no idea of how to pay for them. That's called, they'll get a fiscal impact statement, which is basically, this is how much the bill costs. The NEAR Act wasn't funded for the first 3 years. In fact, those of us who advocated for changing the way we approach public safety complained frequently that the NEAR Act was underfunded or not funded fully. So let's be honest with residents about what we're dealing with. We have a council that does not treat its legislative responsibility seriously. If you're gonna write a bill, think through what implementation looks like. Get the FISP before you introduce it. Find out how much it's gonna cost. Talk to your colleagues. Actually whip votes. Convince the people that you work with. Heaven forbid you have a conversation with the executive and convince them as opposed to just dropping a mandate on them. And then suddenly our city's working together. Suddenly it's safer. Now, one of the things I talked about earlier was the fact that we have violence interrupter programs that don't work together and they conflict with each other. Part of that is because our council did not go through the effort of convincing the executive that this was a process that they should engage in. So instead of actually going through the executive, which has the infrastructure and support to run a program, they dumped it in the Attorney General's office. So now we have violence interrupters in the AG's office and violence interrupters in the executive's office, and they don't work well together. This is not what responsible legislators do. We can do better. We deserve better.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall. Mr. Niosi, please. 90 seconds.
So one of the big things that I found when I was doing my community outreach was a lot of people just want to be heard. They want the time of day. They want their council members to be present. They want them to be approachable. So I believe in mentorship. I think that having a viable mentorship program is something very important. Actually, one of the organizations I work with in Ward 7 is called Men of Influence, and they do a wonderful job either bringing youth off the streets or returning citizens and giving them a job. And so that's something I think is very important. But not only that, as Mr. Hill was saying, I do believe that we should have a better funding for our police department because having done 2 ride-alongs so far, I'm scheduled to do a third, I was able to talk to a lot of our police officers, and they lack a lot of training that they really want. They want training to learn how they could, as simple as filling out documentation, or just how to work with various community members. And then lastly, I do think that community policing in its own right is very important. Because I remember a time when we're DC, cultural DC, we had a lot of arts, we had a lot of music going on, and I think that that's something that should be reintroduced and there should be a fire lit under it, because that's a great thing that we should be having is the arts. Which I love what the mayor has done with the development over in Ward 8 with the new arts district that they're having. I think that's great.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Schwartzman, 90 seconds.
Yes, the NEAR Act was a very important initiative. Neighborhood engagement achieves results. Charles Allen informed us recently the budget has increased for it. However, the mayor needs to pay attention to the DC Orders report, in particular to establish an Office of Violence Prevention and Health Equity within DC Health, and also create real cooperation with MPD and the Department of Behavioral Health to have teams go out to deal with behavioral problems. So this is a public health approach. That's what we need. And I participated at noon. I was listening to the Health Alliance Network's presentation, Ambrose Lane Jr. leading that, on violence. What's the roots? One of the biggest roots is poverty, and particularly child poverty. And we need to take very proactive action to eliminate child poverty. Simply, we have the tax base to do this. Okay, the corporate sector needs to pay more taxes to address this. This will improve the life of all residents, not only the children and their family, all residents.
Thank you. Do I want to do a quick time check? It's now 6:24. I want to remind everyone that there is water. Thank you, Toya. Want to remind everyone that we're streaming live on Facebook, on YouTube as well. We encourage our Facebook viewers to drop your questions in the chat. We will be tossing the microphone out to the audience around 6:45, so we have about another 15 minutes of questions from our sponsors. We're going to continue talking about public safety, then we'll go into housing. Around 6:45, we hope to turn the table over to our audience members, so please keep your questions in mind, write them down. We want to open the floor for you to engage with your candidates as well, and that goes for our audience tuning in on Facebook Live. We will monitor the chat for that. So we're moving on to another question. I'm going to combine a few because we're staying with the public safety theme, and we know that our neighbors in Prince George's County have just reinforced or are enforcing the curfew for young people. We have a curfew for young people on the books. You can argue whether or not it is enforced. One, do you believe that we should enforce, that MPD should enforce the curfew laws that we already have in place? Do they work? Do they not work? And I'll give you 2 minutes for this answer because it's a two-part. Because I do curfew is geared towards keeping these young people off the streets. However, we know a lot of these crimes are not happening at night. They're happening in the middle of the day after school hours. So, one, do you think MPD should enforce the curfews that we have on the books? Why or why not? And two, what is a strategy to really address the crime that's involved, that's just, overcoming our young people in this city? So I'm going to start with Mr. Marshall with that question. And I'll give you 2 minutes.
I'm going to solve this very complicated issue in less than 2 minutes. Okay, so I want to start off with this. I am still not convinced that curfews are constitutional, and if you are, approached by a police officer, I will remind you that you have an affirmative duty to assert your Fifth Amendment right. It is no longer assumed that you can. So that's, I think, is the most important thing. My biggest issue with reliance on a curfew, whether or not it actually works, is that it deals with symptoms, right? Like, this isn't necessarily about whether or not we're eliminating the causes of crime, whether or not we're making our communities more secure. We're just keeping a certain percentage of the population off the street at a certain time of day in the hopes that they won't violate the curfew and commit a crime. What I know it will do is increase the number of contacts between younger students or anyone below the age of 18 and police officers. I think our police officers aren't really in a position right now to be the best people to be policing these types of issues. I think if we really want to make sure that we're addressing issues of crime, we have to deal with the parent of crime, which is poverty. And I don't see the curfew actually addressing that issue. Now, if I had a conversation as an executive or as even a legislature with our neighboring jurisdictions where we talked about doing something in a concerted fashion, because I think we know, I mean, those kids that killed someone over by the ballpark, they actually live in Maryland. So if we're talking about actually addressing crime across the board, the first thing we have to prioritize is eliminating the causes of crime. But secondarily, we need to be thinking about how we cooperate as jurisdictions. How do we share intelligence? How do we share resources? But most importantly, how do we make sure that our kids feel like they have a future? Like, if you think you've got something happening after you get out of high school, you're not really going to go down to Nat Stadium and carjack somebody and then sell a car for $500. Because you have a future. And you don't want to mortgage your future for $500. So let's talk about that just as much as a curfew.
Thank you, Ms. Silverman. Do you think that MPD should enforce the curfew, and what are the real strategies that you believe could curb the violence that our young people are involved in?
Yes. So I believe that curfew is a distraction from what is really disturbing to me, at least. We have 13, 14, 15-year-olds with access to guns. And that a curfew isn't going to address that issue. And let me say that my committee has put a lot of money into youth employment. We've vastly expanded the year-round employment program, which was local funds 0 to we're going to have 1,000 slots in this upcoming budget. I can't remember what the budget number is. And we're reserving 100 of those slots for what, it might not be the most politically correct term, but at-risk youth. But I can put all the dollars I want into youth employment, but if we have kids who are dealing with conflict and trauma and settling disputes that start on social media with a weapon, then all the money that I'm putting into the SYEP and into the high school internship program just isn't going to make a difference, in my opinion. So we really have to address this issue of access to guns and the behavioral health issues. I think so my committee did fund the violence interruption program. My labor committee provided the seed funding for the Attorney General's Cure the Streets program, and I'll tell you why. Because in Memorial Day of 2018, there was a horrific shooting. 13 people were shot, and I called the Attorney General and I said, let's fund your program, because the mayor wasn't funding the MIR Act. That's how it happened. And I think my time is up. Can I apologize, Delia? There is a conflicting DC Women in Politics forum that begins at 6:30. I had informed Philip weeks ago about this. I'm going to have to leave. I apologize to my fellow candidates and to all those who are here. I will be in a study carrel 302H if you want to find me after that forum. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Delia, for your moderation.
Thank you for your time. We're going to move on as Ms. Silverman slips out in the sake of time. Mr. Schwartzman, same question.
Yes, the same question. Goodbye, Lisa. See you next time. Here is I brought clippings with me so I can quote from them. This is what a Georgetown University law professor and legal and policy director of DC Lawyers for Youth says about curfews. It's a really blunt instrument that criminalizes and impedes on the rights of young people, particularly black youth. The risks are high, the benefits are very low. And I know that black youth are frequently victims of harassment, and they are arrested in the enforcement of the curfew. We also know that there are far-right racist groups that have infiltrated our own police force. I'm not saying all the police are racist, of course, but that was documented in the Washington Post. There's investigation. They've infiltrated all over the country. So the police can be an asset, of course, but they could also be a problem. And black youth have been killed by police in D.C. Deontay Rawlings in 2007 was shot to death by 2 off-duty police, and the police never were held responsible. And there have been other killings since. And yet, the police should be held accountable. We need a civilian police review board elected with subpoena power. Okay? We can't leave it to the internal operation of the police themselves. And now, I have to stop. And I obey the stop sign, unlike a few other candidates.
Thank you, Mr. Schwartzman. We are going to go to Mr. Hill, Mr. McLaughlin, and then Mr. Neosi. So same question, 2 minutes. Do you believe the curfew should be enforced? And what is your strategy in addressing this youth violence?
Thank you. I'm going to be absolutely different than everyone you've heard. As a father, a grandfather, and a veteran, no, on the curfew. It is not going to do what needs to be done, as what I'm about to say. The parents of these juveniles need to be held accountable and share the penalty of what their children are doing. Much of what the other candidates talked about today is long-term solutions. And yes, it needs to be instituted and carried out. But right now, when a gun goes off in the district, we shouldn't be standing up saying, did they have a mother? Did they have a father? Did they get 2 scoops of sugar in their Cheerios this morning before they're sentenced? They kill someone. That person is not getting a second opportunity. If that youngster kills someone and they're 18, they get to start their life back over again. We've got to wake up in this city and realize that the problem is us when we don't hold them accountable. And that's the first thing that needs to be done. Our judicial system is split. The Attorney General takes care of the juveniles, the federal system takes care of the adults. I say that if we put the penalty out there, that if it's 1st or 2nd degree murder, you are done. And I promise you, you're going to see a change. If you're caught with an illegal gun, instead of straight 50, you know it's illegal, you know it's not yours, you know you're breaking the law. A lot of people might not like it, but I've seen it. As a veteran, I've traveled to all 7 continents, and I've watched how these kinds of things only happen in this country. They have strict gun laws in other areas, and some have no guns at all. But until we wake up, we're going to continue to see this go in the same direction. Stop putting the Band-Aid on and fix it.
Thank you, Mr. McLaughlin. 2 minutes, rather.
Well, I'm glad I'm sitting between these two, because I think actually I would say my opinion is the same, in between. But I'm actually going to center it on a voice that we haven't heard from yet, which is the voice of young people. So I volunteered once a week at DYRS, the Juvenile Detention Center, for a number of years, and then lost a lot of basketball games there on Saturdays as well. And I was on a call about 2 weeks ago with Chief Conti, the Trigger Project, and some young people talking about solutions to youth violence. And then you already heard about my informal polling of Eastern high school students. But there's a couple things that I heard every time from the young people. One with some of the things that we've already talked about of, I want to feel safe. I want to not have to worry that I'm going to get into some kind of beef when I'm walking to school. I want to be able to have the supports that I need to be able to graduate effectively, to have a vision for where I'm going, etc. And I think, Kareem and others spoke eloquently on that. And they also say Virginia doesn't play. And I think I disagree with Fred on some of the pretty large sentences, but the idea, where is there accountability to saying, if you hurt other people, it's not okay? And so, the solutions that I think we have to wrestle with as a city are, how are we supporting and wrapping our arms around young people? And how are we making sure, as they are on the continuum of victim and violent offender, that we ensure that we are supporting them and not going that way? And then if they do, escalating levels. I think the challenge that we have in many jurisdictions and here in the past is it's 0 to 50 years. How are we not saying, okay, you have this really terrible consequence when your brain is still developing, but at the same time, it is absolutely not okay to hurt other people, and we can't just let you get away with it. So I think we have to find that balance. I think we have to have accountability and solutions that are short-term as well as long-term to stop the violence.
Thank you. And finally, Mr. Neosi.
Thank you. One of the things that I remember growing up is we used to have the 11 o'clock curfew, and whenever I would go out with my friends, I would always have to make sure I caught the correct train to get back home, because if I crossed the threshold of my door at 11:01, my mom was going to kick my butt. And so I think that you're right. The people who are going to be committing the crimes are already going to be committing the crimes. I think that's where we need to address the issue, because the curfew, I don't think, is going to actually work in the way we intend for it to work. If anything, it's a band-aid on the bigger problem. I would encourage to have some semblance of after-school programs, such as trade schools or technical development programs, where people, as Mr. Marshall was saying, where they could learn that they are going to have a future in whatever skill set that they want to have. One of the things I became aware of is, the military can actually go to high schools and recruit, which is, whether you agree with the military or not, it's certainly a job out of high school that is a prominent job. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, I do believe that accountability is absolute, and I think that we should focus on the leniency that we've been having for any of these sentencing for these young children. I think that we shouldn't necessarily be putting them in prison for 50 years, but there has to be a consequence for the action, that if they're going to commit a crime, they're going to do some time.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to housing. Another time check at 6:40, so we'll wrap up this portion and hopefully turn the mic over to some wonderful questions from our audience members. The city is facing an affordable housing crisis, particularly when it comes to rental properties. Some housing advocates have called for changes to the city's rent control laws to protect dwindling housing stock. What bill or policy do you support that will not only protect the city's affordable rental units, but also increase the number of them? Mr. Hill.
Thank you so much.
90 seconds.
90 seconds, okay. First, we must remember that we do not have affordable housing. It is only affordable to those who can afford it. The housing stock right now should be made based on a person's income and not the average median income scale that we use that's on the federal. We have 2 counties, which are the richest in the country, that bring that number way up. And so a lot of people are left out of that. I've said earlier that our MPD, our fire emergency staff, our public school system, and our sanitation workers are included in a plan that would put them in above the average median income. But here's some other things that we need to keep in mind. The developers that put forth the projects are in many ways being given an open door to do just whatever they want. And by the time it's done, the project starts out as being advertised for veterans, for seniors, for low income. And I've tracked 5 to 6 different projects that were supposed to have 20 or more low income families living in 280 units that now today only have 2. And because the public doesn't know what our council is not going to enforce, their friends get to go to the next project. and it should stop. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Schwartzman, 90 seconds.
Well, I will begin by saying housing is a human right. So is education. So is the right to live at the highest life expectancy possible, which is being denied right here because of trickle-down economics. And we have the Housing Production Trust Fund, that's the main vehicle. It is based on really building rental market rate housing, which is unaffordable to a great majority of our residents. Market rate, it's not affordable. And then they have a sort of a trickle-down approach. Okay, you'll get some low income, but the DC auditors show they don't even meet the requirements they're supposed to. That's the short-term solution. Increase the lower income requirements. The midterm solution is to decommodify the provision of housing. Okay, so you have social housing approach, Denise Lewis George Green New Deal bill, and community land trusts. That's a way to implement truly affordable housing, which is defined as 30% of your household income. How many of you pay more than 30% of your household income for housing? I wonder, all right? We need to make that the goal, decommodify the provision of housing.
Mr. Marshall, 90 seconds.
Okay, so in 90 seconds, the biggest thing that we can do as council members to fix housing is to make sure that we have a competent person running the housing committee. We don't. The current chair didn't know the size of the wait list for public housing, wasn't even aware that the wait list was still there, has no real involvement in the development or vetting of pro formas for development projects. It's kind of asleep at the switch. So here's what I can give you. As a first-year council member, I won't get a committee. The housing committees, every single pro forma that comes through the council will be viewed with a deliberate eye. We won't necessarily say skeptical, but I'm going to look at every single one. And I'm the only person with the skill set to do that because I'm the only person who's worked on development projects. What I can also promise you is that we need to be a little bit more creative about the way in which we deal with housing as a jurisdiction. Most of you live on blocks that have at least one or two vacant houses, right? Like everybody can think of one or two vacant houses that are in their neighborhood. Now, if I told you that we know for a fact there are at least 10,000 vacant houses in the District of Columbia, I say we start with those. For various reasons, families aren't using these houses, they aren't renting them out, they aren't selling them, mostly because of title issues. Getting a lawyer on the council gives you someone who understands what tools we can employ to actually activate some of this housing. The problem is we don't have enough in supply. So if we can fix the supply issue, we can fix the affordability issue.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall. We have two more candidates to answer this last question. We're going to pivot over to our audience. If we can ask audience members to form a line on either aisle, just to make it easier so we're not snaking through the seats, that might make it a bit easier so we can make this process smooth. So as we prepare for that, thank you, Toya. Mr. Niosi, that same question in regards to affordable housing and the crisis that the city is facing.
Thank you for the question. First off, I think that we need to address what exactly affordable housing actually means for the residents of Washington, D.C., because there are a multitude of different levels as to, we need single-family homes, we need workforce development homes, we need low-income housing. One of the things that I actually have a big problem is, we see a lot of development happening, for example, in the Navy Yard, and half the people that live in those houses don't actually pay taxes in Washington, D.C., and I think that that's problematic. That they don't have any sort of vote in terms of who they want to guide. And I would also kind of address one thing that Mr. Marshall was saying is, as an engineer, I've worked on shipbuilding projects, which I know is not necessarily the exact same as housing. However, the thought process is very much the same, because a ship is very much like a small city. Exactly. So having an engineer with that expertise and quality assurance, I think, would trade well for the council.
Mr. McLaughlin.
Well, having a brother who's in the Navy and has lived on ships, I really hope that I never have to conflict the two in my personal life. But I will also say, you know, you're on fire, so I'm not going to be too mad at you. I also have development experience, but I agree with a lot of the points that you made. And, you know, this is where, when the city and council members are here, they bemoan the fact that we're putting more and more money towards housing, and yet we're not getting the solutions, and they're going to take new actions and things. We got to have new people who know what they're doing on this if we're going to be able to change things. So, like Kareem, I'm going to go into a lot of specifics because number one, we just need more housing if we're going to have more affordable housing. So we have to think about zoning. Are we expanding 2 and 4 unit zoning? Are we partnering with faith institutions to slightly tweak their zoning to be able to create more affordable housing? Are we thinking about public and quasi-public land and thinking about how we can increase from 10 to 20 or 30% the affordable housing on those lands? There's so many solutions I can keep going on to really talk through this. But we need council members who are going to get into the operational details, who understand the pro formas, and candidly who are going to work with developers because they are the housing producers to be able to say, how do we create something fair and effective, but I'll end on as well. It can't just be production, it also in order to create affordable housing.
Next question. America already has the largest prison population in the entire world. Locking up more black people isn't a viable solution to society's problems of inequity that they've created. There is one more question in the chat, but I'll go to our audience members for a question. And if you can either direct that to a particular candidate or just we're going to open, identify whether we're going to open that to the whole floor.
How you doing? My name is Charles Owens. Living in Ward 8. Yeah, I live in Ward 8 in the co-op. To you, Mr. Hill, I appreciate your 2 comments about housing and a remedy for the murders that take place. So anytime somebody gets shot or killed, they don't get a chance to come back. You have to do something, and taking a sledgehammer to the situation, it may be overkill to use a metaphor, but we need to do something to stop the violence for young people who are afraid and the fear.
Instead of these 4, renovate that project and watch this craziness go on over and over. Developers that are right here in the city and allow them to be a part of that development, employment opportunity for those who work for those small businesses, because enough unpaid is ridiculous. As 25 years I've been in this landscape of who's doing that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. We have another question.
Yes, I have a question. My question is, I see the best education that they can, but we still have some students that our educators and our schools can get the resources that they need to help some of those students get to level.
So, is this on? So as the father of a 2-year-old, child literacy requirement, some that can't. Like, let's be honest about this. The has and the educational attainment of that child. What I would do, because that's when their brains are moving quickly. That's when they're developing thousands as quickly as possible. And if we don't provide supplements and resources,
The root of thank you. Stop sign.
Thank you. We can do rolling stops here. It's all right.
Everybody, and I want a direct answer. She's no participant. In order to be a state, see people who are, where would you specifically? Thank you.
Thank you for that.
You might not like it, but I wouldn't worry about where I'm going to house those who are incarcerated across the country, because we don't have our own prison. But if we don't get that, we start operating like one. We can do that right now. Right now, as we make more room for those who are here.
Mr. McLaughlin will go down the line.
Yeah, just due to the belief that we should
Can you
take
speak
over
into the
the
mic,
federal
please?
role. I said some really good stuff before you all went back to DC. I think this is a social justice issue. I think this is an effective finance issue and something.
First of all, those who have committed felonies, get them out of prison. DC jail, which they'll plan Norway is living. It's rehabilitation, not torture them, which is
Everyone this evening.
And we have them come in and shut it down. And everything. Thank you.
And it is. It's like one of these things where What y'all gonna do about what y'all gonna do about the poor people? But that
Sir?
yeah, what y'all gonna do about that?
As long as I'm doing this, please check out my website, marshall4dc.com, where we've got more that people can actually afford to buy and stay in decent stress by our current system. Take more than 30% of your income.
The members of the community that are being impacted by the development. So, yeah, these are the concerns.
That their mortgage would be the Warden Hotel. Stop sign.
Pathways to opportunities.
Thank you. Again, I'm going to be completely different than income. The opportunities that we have, the pay to go along with the increase of it comes to our government employees that I announced, believe when we put them into above the average median income.
Our viewers on Facebook, the code, long-term refusal to keep property. I'll weigh in on that, Mr. Marshall. We'll go down the line real briefly and don't do that.
Okay, quickly.
I'll take 20.
For using their properties as extractive NIM property. We haven't done it because our government's not efficient. Once we get it for low-income families, absolutely.
I think that, kind of what Kareem just said, those are all the...
Our President Attorney General has taken some legal action, and I'd like to see them don't often go to jail. My time ago.
It's getting these questions into us, so thank you. Thanks for everybody online. The one thing I'll say is I think it's really hard to just say, oh yeah, we should, but also
Just involved in
Call 911, right? This is, disputes and being shot by police, by mental health.
Those are the things right now that we
category as fee waived. I'll try to do
Real briefly so we can move on.
yeah, again, says some great stuff. Everyone, so whether I have a visceral or lived experience, I want to make sure that because we're not a state, we don't provide, that we have to put key staff in place.
Good evening. There are many locations, life and property values, and brownfields. What, if any, plans do you have to help build sites?
I'm sorry, I didn't get the full question.
There are many locations throughout towns.
Yes, I get it. I'm one of the biggest Pacific residents in public pay. And
Mr. Marshall?
The degree to which we have deliberately honesty. Now, I've got plans on how I would do single steps on it because I know this.
Information. All right, this is a teaser.
here. I would try to ensure that each one, where not many people actually know where these plant sites are located.
Discrete, specific operational steps to change it. This is it that we can take, and to just at these points, the very specific operational ways that we can. Do we have the political council members?
Thank you,
filmed?
Mr.
I will. I think others on here will.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hill.
I'm gonna be real being paid to do. That's why those sites exist. Most people don't know that every DC government. So that's what we need to do. We need to have better oversight and management.
Thank you. And my question is, do we want one in DC? Or the benefits? Thank you. The question is to...
I'm sorry. We're going to start with Mr. Hill.
Willing to reinvest back into the community. Right now, we have, by many of what I've seen, they can't go in and borrow $10. So it needs to be a more balanced approach. We'll do in any community.
I don't know where $80+ million went into health cooperatives. How are we thinking about money staying local and being circular? But also the idea of how are we incenting co-ops? How are we incenting
DC Public Banking Center for 7 years. And this objective should, our revenue is now being held a public and then partner with great benefits, green jobs, and so forth.
This isn't really a lane that I'm familiar with. I'm not into financials, so thank you for the question.
Mr. Marshall.
So I actually worked on the Green Bank legislation account, and we got our capital borrow and using that money in a way to create additional political power for our residents.
Question, and we'll keep our answer.
So the three that are nearest and dearest to mine, because I've got 7 years of experience.
Education and local business.
It would be the tax and revenue.
Operations, housing, and economic development.
Okay, we have 2 more audience questions. We do have Lady in Black.
Good evening. It lasts for racial equity.
30 seconds.
We need to help organize the public to.
We need to make sure that we have the educational piece uplifted. We need to make sure that those residents in all of those can more employment, meaningful employment with our government.
Council members, the idea of the oversight and what I see of the really performance is a little too strong, but the idea you're always kind of playing. You don't have to have collegial focus, but holding accountable oversight. We need to really say that is a critical aspect of KPIs.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall.
For council, and you don't have to be a bootlicker to work with her. It's completely possible. That needs to be a year-round thing. You can't go on school tours in August and then expect things to get fixed before school's open. Like that just doesn't work. Additionally, when I structure hearings, I would structure. Finally, I would be more aggressive about confirmation. We can't wait for confirmation. Approve.
So, again, it's a 30-second answer. Not a lot can be said, but one of the things that I've really in all the words, but also have a community roundtables. So the status quo is just not working for everybody. And then lastly, making sure that some semblance of return on investment for everybody.
Thank you.
They have to sit here when they know.
Some years ago for citizens, and we still haven't done it. That's another thing.
I think the scenario you outlined there would probably be a help. I think we need to increase those reimbursement careers for district residents, and we need the reimbursement rate. I know that's really for people.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall, Mr. Neosi, and then Mr. Schultz.
Okay, 30 seconds. I think we don't do a very good job of supporting people who are most in need, particularly you might leave, but if you make $50,000 or less, the government can't miss.
Question, and very much to echo what the majority of people have been saying. Taxes for seniors, I think that's a big thing. But all these decisions need to be made in the household, and so making sure that we have different funded programs that can work with the.
For over 20 years, and one of my ideas that's being for that is the low-income folks, income folk, a check.
I do think that the
legal, effective.
I think we need to treat it like just as bad as alcohol.
Just as alcohol, and then you're going to drive around. Smart about.
Thank you so much again to